You have been told your whole life that the pyramids were tombs, giant stone graves built by a pharaoh with an ego so enormous it could only be measured in limestone. That is the version that fits neatly into a textbook, the version that gets printed without footnote or hesitation, the version repeated so many times it calcified into certainty. But here is what the history books almost never mention. Not a single pharaoh's body has ever been found inside the Great Pyramid of Giza. Not one. No mummy, no sarcophagus sealed with a royal body inside, no burial goods surrounding a king's remains, nothing that definitively proves the structure you have spent your whole life calling a tomb was ever actually used as one. That absence should have shattered the official narrative decades ago. Instead, it got buried under the same weight of institutional repetition that built the myth in the first place. So the real question isn't how the pyramids were built. The real question is what they were actually for, and why the answer is so much stranger, so much more deliberate, and so much harder to accept than anything you learned in school. Stand at the base of the Great Pyramid today, and the scale alone attacks your senses before your mind has a chance to organize a thought. Each of the roughly 2,300,000 stone blocks weighing between 2 and 15 tons sits locked against the next, with joints so precise you cannot slide a sheet of paper between them. The outer casing stones, most of which were stripped away during the medieval period to build Cairo's mosques, were polished to a finish that ancient Greek and Roman visitors compared to white fire under the sun. From a distance, it did not look like a building. It looked like a geometric eruption from the desert floor, a shape so alien in its perfection that early Arab chroniclers refused to believe human hands had made it without divine assistance. But the wonder of the construction, as mesmerizing as it is, has always been used to crowd out the deeper question. How they built it has eclipsed why they built it. And those two questions do not have the same answer. The tomb theory rests almost entirely on a single assumption, that because later, smaller Egyptian pyramids from the Middle Kingdom period clearly were used as burial sites, the earlier and far more sophisticated structures at Giza must have served the same purpose. That is a logical leap. It is the equivalent of concluding that because a modern sports stadium and an ancient Greek amphitheatre are both large outdoor structures where crowds gather, they must have been built for the same reason. The reasoning sounds coherent until you examine the physical evidence directly, and then it starts to dissolve. Egyptologist Flinders Petrie, who conducted the first precise measurements of the Great Pyramid in the 1880s, documented alignment tolerances so tight they would challenge modern construction equipment. The 4 base sides align with true north, south, east, and west, with an accuracy of less than 1/20th of a single degree. The pyramid sits almost exactly at the geographic center of the Earth's landmass when you measure latitude and longitude. These are not the priorities of a man who wanted a glorious burial chamber. These are the priorities of someone building a precision instrument. The interior of the Great Pyramid complicates the tomb theory further. There are 3 chambers inside the structure, none of which follow the burial conventions established in earlier or contemporary Egyptian tombs. The so-called King's Chamber sits in the very heart of the pyramid, constructed entirely from massive blocks of red Aswan granite imported from over 800 kilometers away. Inside that chamber there is a lidless, uninscribed stone box that Egyptologists labeled a sarcophagus, but which has no hieroglyphs, no protective spells, no imagery of any kind, and no lid that would have ever sealed it. Compare that to virtually any authenticated royal burial from dynastic Egypt, where the sarcophagus is covered in religious text, nested inside other coffins, surrounded by canopic jars, amulets, food offerings, and the carefully preserved tools of the afterlife journey. The Great Pyramid's central chamber contains none of that. What it does contain is something far more difficult to explain away: A series of shafts running through the granite at precise angles, aimed with astronomical accuracy at specific star positions corresponding to the northern and southern skies, as they appeared over Giza more than 4,500 years ago. Those shafts point to Orion's belt, to the star Thuban, which served as the ancient North Pole star, to Sirius, and to other celestial coordinates of profound religious and calendrical significance in ancient Egyptian cosmology. For decades, Egyptologists dismissed them as ventilation passages, a practical solution for the workers who carved out the interior. But ventilation passages do not need to be astronomically aligned. Ventilation passages do not need to terminate at sealed stone doors discovered by robotic cameras in the 1990s. Ventilation passages do not need to measure the precession of the equinoxes. These shafts were not built to move air. They were built to move something else entirely, something the ancient Egyptians called the Ba, the spiritual essence of a being that could travel between the physical world and the celestial realm. The Great Pyramid was not a place where a body was stored. It was a place where something was meant to be launched. To understand that distinction, you have to understand how ancient Egyptian theology actually worked, which is something the clean summary in most history books actively resists. The Egyptians did not believe death was an ending. They believed it was a transition requiring specific physical infrastructure. The body mattered because it was an anchor, a way of keeping the spiritual components of a person tethered to the world long enough to complete the journey into the field of reeds, their equivalent of paradise. But a pharaoh was not just a person. A pharaoh was the living embodiment of the god Horus on earth, and upon death he became Osiris, the lord of the dead. His transformation was not a private affair, it was a cosmic event with consequences for the entire civilization. If the pharaoh failed to complete his journey to the stars, the cycle of the Nile, the fertility of the land, the stability of the kingdom, and the continuity of divine order itself were all at risk. The pyramid was not built to protect a body. It was built to guarantee a transformation, and the stakes of that transformation were nothing less than the survival of Egyptian civilization as a whole. This reframes everything about the construction. The massive workforce, now understood through papyri and workers' villages, discovered at Giza to have been composed of skilled, well-fed, and medically attended Egyptian laborers rather than slaves, was not simply following the orders of a vain king. They were participants in a state-level religious project of cosmic urgency. The administrative papyrus of Merer, discovered at the Red Sea port of Wadi al-Jarf and dating to the reign of Khufu, describes in precise logistical detail how teams transported limestone blocks from Tura across the Nile and into the Giza Plateau. The language is bureaucratic, but the implication is sacred. These men knew they were building something that existed at the intersection of the human and the divine. The physical labor and the spiritual purpose were not separate categories in their minds. They were the same thing. The internal geography of the pyramid encodes that theology in stone. The descending passage drops deep below the natural rock of the plateau toward the underworld, the realm of Osiris, the place of death and transformation. The ascending passage climbs toward the Grand Gallery, a corbelled vault nearly 9 meters high that does not exist in any other pyramid and has no convincing functional explanation beyond the ceremonial. The Grand Gallery leads to the antechamber, a space with lowering portcullises of pink granite that could have sealed the passage completely, and finally into the king's chamber itself. That sequence, descending into death, ascending through transformation, passing through barriers, arriving at the destination chamber aligned with the stars, mirrors the journey described in the pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings in human history, inscribed on the walls of later 5th Dynasty pyramids, but almost certainly reflecting theological traditions far older than the stone they were carved into. The pyramid was not a monument to a dead king's vanity. It was a three-dimensional enactment of the most important religious narrative in the ancient world. There is another layer to this that textbooks routinely flatten into a footnote. The Egyptians called the Great Pyramid Akhet Khufu, which translates not as Tomb of Khufu, but as Horizon of Khufu, or more precisely, the place where Khufu becomes the horizon. The word Akhet in Egyptian cosmology referred to the liminal point where the sun disappears and reappears, the threshold between worlds, the precise moment of divine transformation. That word choice was not accidental. It was a theological declaration embedded in the name of the structure itself. The pyramid was not a final resting place, it was a threshold. And a threshold, by definition, is not where you stop, it is where you cross over. The plateau at Giza compounds this when you consider all three pyramids together rather than the Great Pyramid in isolation. Researchers Robert Bauval and Adrian Gilbert demonstrated in the 1990s that the ground plan of the three pyramids at Giza mirrors with stunning precision the three stars of Orion's belt as they appeared in the Egyptian sky around 10,500 BCE, a date that aligns with what ancient Egyptian texts call Zep Tepi, the first time, the mythological era, when the gods themselves walked the earth and established the divine order that human civilization was built to maintain. Whether that date reflects the actual age of the structures or the theological age they were designed to encode remains contested, but the alignment itself is not. The Nile's position on the ground corresponds to the position of the Milky Way in the sky. The three pyramids of Giza sit in the same spatial relationship as the three stars of the constellation the Egyptians called Sahu, which we call Orion. This was not coincidence. This was a map of the heavens built from 2,300,000 stones on the desert floor so that it could be read by the gods looking down, and so that the Pharaoh's Bay could look up and know exactly where to go. None of this is fringe speculation. The astronomical alignments are measurable. The linguistic evidence from the pyramid texts is documented. The absence of any verified royal burial inside the Great Pyramid is an archaeological fact. The precision of the construction exceeds what any simple funerary program would demand. What you were taught as settled history was always a working hypothesis dressed up as conclusion, and it was accepted not because the physical evidence demanded it, but because it was the simplest explanation that fit a pre-existing narrative about ancient people building large things to honor their dead leaders. That narrative is comfortable. It keeps the ancient Egyptians at a manageable distance from us, slightly barbaric in their obsession with death, impressive but ultimately primitive in their ambitions. The alternative is more unsettling. The alternative is that these people understood the cosmos with a sophistication that we are only now beginning to quantify, and that they built a structure designed to function at the intersection of physics, theology, astronomy, and statecraft simultaneously. A machine not for preserving a body, but for transforming a soul, at a scale and precision that the modern world has never come close to replicating. You likely woke up this morning, looked at your phone, and scrolled past a dozen notifications before your feet touched the floor. The sky outside your window was just the sky. The stars, if you noticed them at all, were background decoration. Tonight, you will sleep in a bed, in a room, inside a structure built for your comfort and nothing more. The people who raised those stones at Giza before your civilization, before Rome, before Greece, before most of what you call ancient history, looked at that same sky and saw a navigational system, a theological map, a divine address. They built the most precisely engineered structure the ancient world ever produced, not to hold a corpse, but to aim one. The history books gave you the tomb. What was always hiding behind it was something far stranger and far more human. The absolute refusal to believe that transformation ends at death, and the willingness to move 2.5 million tons of stone to prove it. If there is a civilization, a ritual, a lost city, or a corner of human history you want to see stripped of its romantic version and rebuilt from what the evidence actually shows, drop it in the comments. The real history is always darker, stranger, and more fascinating than the one we were handed.